I'm going to call the committee to order and make a brief statement before I give my opening statement. Is that we'll have the chairman and the ranking member both come in their due time, and then we'll break and allow them to do their opening statements. At least we can get started on time, if that's agreeable with everybody, which this seems like it is.
Got the important guys here.
That's right. And now recognize myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. A year ago, we took testimony to examine the air quality impacts of wildfires with a focus on stakeholder perspectives. Given the committee's jurisdiction over air quality policies and public health, the goal then, as it is today, was to develop a better understanding of the health impacts of wildfires and what should be done to minimize those impacts. We return to the topic this afternoon to look closely at the mitigation and management strategies for reducing air quality risks from wildfire smoke. In large part, these strategies involve efforts to reduce the intensity and frequency of wildfires that threaten communities. The strategies also involve managing the inevitable smoke impacts, whether from wildfires or from what is known as prescribed burning. And they involve ensuring that effective actions are credited appropriately in air quality planning, air quality monitoring, and compliance activities, so states and localities are not punished for taking action that will improve public health. Last year, some 10 million acres were burned in the United States by wildfires, the second worst fire season since 1960. As of last week, this fire season has resulted in more than 7 million acres burned, with acute impacts of smoke lingering for extended periods of time throughout California and the Pacific Northwest. The urgency for reducing the severity of these fires is underscored by news reports and reports from this committee's own members, including Chairman Walden, of the impacts of wildfire smoke. This smoke can smother communities with high levels of particulate matter and other respiratory irritants. These levels, which are many-fold over normal air quality, intensify asthma and chronic pulmonary diseases and impact the lives of millions of people. Against this backdrop, our panel of witnesses can speak to the complex set of strategies that are needed to more effectively address wildfires and smoke risks. We will hear today from two state foresters who oversee and implement fire management strategies in their states. Sonia German from the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. Tom, I hope it's Bogus, thank you. Bogus was a word we used at West Point. Bogus is better. So, the Texas State Forester and Director of Texas A&M Forest Service. While the general approaches among state forestry officials to mitigating risk are consistent, there are regional differences that affect what is put into practice and can inform future policymakers. We will hear a state air quality perspective. Mary Anderson, who is with the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, can help us understand the practical challenges of managing wildfire smoke and how our agency works to address air quality risks. Colin O'Mara, president of the National Wildlife Federation, has been before the committee before, brings an environmental perspective, but has also experience as a former head of the state of Delaware's Department of Natural Resources and Environment Control. And finally, we will hear from Oregon State Senator Herman Bertschiger from Southern Oregon, who has extensive experience in forestry and wildland firefighting. I'm looking forward to his perspective on what to do and his perspective on the impacts of wildfires on his constituents. Let me welcome the panelists. I look forward to understanding the challenges and the opportunities you face and what you can do to ensure our federal air regulations accommodate these strategies. And with my remainder of time, I'd like to yield to the gentleman of Texas, Mr. Flores.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding me a part of your time, and thank you for holding today's important hearing. I'm pleased to welcome my constituent, Mr. Tom Bogus, to today's hearing. He is testifying on behalf of the National Association of State Foresters. Mr. Bogus is a native of Fort Stockton, Texas, and he joined the Texas A&M Forest Service in 1980. He was appointed as the director and state forester of the Texas A&M Forest Service in February of 2010, and he has extensive familiarity with the issue we're going to be discussing today. I look forward to hearing from him along with the rest of our expert witnesses on how we can appropriately manage our forests to minimize wildfire impacts. Thank you, and I yield back. Welcome, Mr. Bogus.
Gentlemen, yield back his time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here this afternoon. As some of you may remember, this subcommittee held a similar hearing last year on wildfires and air quality issues. Since that time, we confirmed that in 2017, more than 66,000 wildfires burned approximately 10 million acres. 2018 is proving to be another difficult year. Right now, there are over 80 active fires covering over 1 million acres and threatening people's health, safety, and property, including the Mendocino Complex fire, the largest recorded fire in California's history. Undeniably, these fires have become increasingly worse in recent years. Today, we will hear about the consequences of wildfires to both human health as well as forest health. Smoke, which includes particulate matter, is harming people, and the growing number and size of these fires are erasing the gains that have been made under the Clean Air Act in reducing fine particulate matter pollution. We will also hear about the best practices in forest management, including prescribed burns and other tools that can mitigate some of the worst impacts of these fires and reduce the harm of smoke. While I do not follow this issue as closely as many of our Western colleagues, my understanding is that historically, the method for funding the United States Forest Service emergency fire response has been a major factor in limiting funding for more proactive forest management activities. In March, Congress passed the fiscal year 2018 Omnibus Appropriations Bill, which included a fire funding fix that will take effect in fiscal year 2020. I acknowledge that more may need to be done to promote better forest management techniques, but we must see how this fix plays out before adopting new major provisions that undermine environmental laws in our national forests. As we discuss the devastation that can be caused by Mother Nature, we must also acknowledge our fellow Americans that are facing down Hurricane Florence. Whether it is hurricanes on the East Coast or fires out west, we are experiencing more frequent and costly natural disasters across our country. As with hurricanes, climate change creates conditions that make wildfires worse. Droughts, drier soils, and higher temperatures, all associated with climate change, are resulting in a longer fire season and causing an increase in the severity and frequency of wildfires. A 2016 study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences concluded that human-caused climate change is responsible for the doubling of the area burned by wildfires since 1984. In 2017, the National Wildfire Federation, which is represented here today by NWF President Colin O'Mara, released a report entitled Mega Fires, which examined how climate change and other issues, including the funding issues at the United States Forest Service, are contributing to this growing problem. I appreciate our witnesses being here to discuss the consequences of wildfires, air quality being chief amongst them, as well as some of the potential mitigation options, such as more proactive forest management. But we do ourselves a disservice if we continue to hold hearings only looking at the effects of these fires while ignoring the underlying causes, including climate change that will continue to exacerbate this problem. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and I yield the remainder of my time to my good friend and colleague, Representative Matsui of California.
Thank you, Ranking Member Tonko, for yielding, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I appreciate the subcommittee is holding a hearing on this important issue. California has had a historic year for fire. The Mendocino Complex fire consumed over 410,000 acres, burning for more than a month and becoming the largest in our state's history. The Ferguson fire took the lives of 2 brave firefighters and closed Yosemite National Park for 20 days. And the Carr fire destroyed over 1,000 homes near Redding, north of my district. While my district was fortunate and did not directly endure a wildfire this summer, Sacramento residents still had to contend with the smothering impacts of wildfire smoke. We had a record-breaking streak of 15 consecutive spare the air days when air quality was so poor that our air district encouraged people to stay inside and reduce pollution in any way possible. If we don't take meaningful steps to reduce the risk and intensity of wildfires, then we will continue to face these overwhelming health, safety, and environmental challenges. That means we must adopt a sustainable approach to wildfire risk reduction. Management policies must recognize the impacts of climate change and the need to sustainably reduce the fuel load in our forests, ultimately moving their condition towards the pre-fire exclusion baseline. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses. I yield back.
And I yield back our remaining 8 seconds. There you go.
Gentleman yields back his time. Okay. The chairman is running over here. The ranking member, I can see, is still on the floor. So we will begin with our witnesses and then interrupt as we can. We want to thank you all for being here today, taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements, followed by a round of questions from members. Our witness panel And I've already announced the panel. So I'd like to now turn to Mr. Bearchigger, Senator, Oregon State Senator, and I'm sure Congressman Walden from Oregon will get here for most of your opening statement. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Simkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the committee. Thank you for letting me have the opportunity to testify before you today about wildfires and their impact on my constituents and the people of Oregon. The lingering effects of smoke and large fires impact thousands of people in my state every year. Immediate suppression of wildland fires during peak fire season would alleviate the impacts to our communities. In exchange for a suppression model, we must be conscious of the fact that our forests still need management, and fire is one of those management tools. But this can be accomplished outside of fire season by controlled burning. Smoke from controlled burns is far less impactful to my constituents than these large fires during the summer months. Other management activities, including commodity production, logging, fuel reduction, are also effective in reducing the risks of severe fire. My name is Herman Bearchigger, and I am an Oregon State Senator representing Southern Oregon. My background is in forestry and wildland firefighting. In more than 4 decades of firefighting in the West, I've never seen a catastrophic, high-intensity wildfire benefit our forests. However, I have seen many examples of low-intensity fire benefit our forests. Fire has always been with us, and that's not going to change likely. Large fires have affected the American people throughout our history. The fires of 1910 in Idaho, Montana, and Washington that burned 3 million acres changed how the U.S. Forest Service addressed fires. In Oregon, the Tillamook fires that occurred in the Coast Range 4 times between 1933 and 1951 forced Oregon also to address wildland fires. This approach is what at times having us fighting large fires rather than suppressing small fires. The aggressive fire suppression model changed about 30 years ago with the U.S. Forest Service, changed from a fire suppression to a fire management. The comparison of fire suppression against fire management is best shown in a comparison of firefighting divisions of Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service. Oregon Department of Forestry has always employed an aggressive initial attack and suppression approach. The comparison of lands managed shows a shocking disparity between the 2 styles of firefighting. The U.S. Forest Service protects about 17 million acres of Oregon forest lands, and so far in 2018, 300,000 of those acres have burned. Oregon Department of Forestry protects about 16 million acres of forest lands in Oregon, and so far only 70,000 of those acres have burned. The 2 agencies protect about the same number of acres in Oregon, but are having very different outcomes. Also, the human factor can't be ignored. With over 300 million people in this country, we should expect more human-caused fire starts. Some people say that 9 out of 10 fires have a human element. Due to severe wildfires, the lack of forest management and the different approach to firefighting, our communities have suffered weeks from toxic smoke. This year, citizens in Southern Oregon endured 34 days of unhealthy air quality. Travel Oregon estimated last year that $51 million was lost from smoke and tourism dollars. The Shakespeare Festival in Ashland has lost over $2 million this year. Hell's Gate excursion, $1.5 million. Smoke has led to cancellation and delays of school activities, church activities, and other events. To provide our citizens with relief from catastrophic wildfire, Congress should take action to promote active forest management and provide oversight and assure accountability over the U.S. Forest Service. Managing fire during peak fire season to treat fuels is no longer acceptable. We cannot manage our forest during peak fire season with fire at the expense of the health and welfare and the economic viability of our communities. We've got to do something else. I appreciate this opportunity to testify, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, another Oregonian, Chairman Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being a little late. We had the WRDA bill on the floor where a number of our provisions, including Safe Drinking Water Act and some provisions for drought relief in the Klamath Basin, were before the House. So I needed to speak on that before coming here. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Today's hearing focuses on this topic that you've already heard from the Senator about, of great concern to Oregonians and those across the West who are experiencing terrible air quality, hazardous, dangerous, unhealthy air quality. Smoke from these wildfires is literally choking people to death. In my home state of Oregon alone, we've already seen over 700,000 acres destroyed by fire. These fires have left communities in my district blanketed with smoke and with the worst air quality in the world, period. Stop. Medford, Oregon experienced the worst run of unhealthy air quality since the EPA began making such determinations in 2000. The leading offender is particulate matter. An article in the New England Journal of Medicine in March pointed out the robust evidence linking exposure to particulate matter to cardiopulmonary mortality and issues with asthma and COPD. I heard from a woman yesterday on Teletown Hall, COPD. She was just getting out of the hospital, all as a result of this smoke. According to EPA research, premature deaths tied to wildfire air pollution were as high as 2,500 per year between 2008 and 2012. Other research out of Colorado State University suggests it could be as high as 25,000 people per year die prematurely because of this smoke. This is a life and death matter in the West. Making matters worse, it's hard to escape the smoke, even in your own home. Kurt in Eagle Point dropped off this air filter from his CPAP machine. I've got a picture of it up there. That filter is supposed to last for 2 weeks. That's, I believe, 2 days. You can see it up there and how dirty it got within 2 days inside his home during these fires. Or take this car cabin air filter. It was replaced after 2 months during the fire season. You can see up on the screen what a new one looks like. 2 months, that's what it looked like in his car. Nearly 3 decades of poor management have left our federal forests overstocked with trees and vegetation that fuel increasingly intense fires. Stepping up active forest management practices such as thinning, prescribed fire, and timber harvest, one of the best ways we could reduce the fuel loads and therefore the impact of the smoke from wildfires. Sadly, bureaucratic red tape, obstructionist litigation by special interest groups, it's all added up to make it very difficult to implement these science-based management techniques that we know work. And we're left to choke on the resulting wildfire smoke. 2017, the number of fires started on lands protected by the Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service land were split nearly 50-50. Forest managed lands, however, accounted for over 90% of the acres burned, so that's the federal ground. This is partly due to forest management, but also how fires are fought. As fires are managed rather than suppressed and backburned acreages increase, there's a clear impact on air quality and therefore on the air quality and health of our citizens. These agencies need to do more to take this into account when they make their decisions. As devastating as it is in the summer months, fire can also be a management tool. We know that. Prescribed fire after mechanical thinning can help reduce fuel loads and reduce emissions by up to 75% if it's done at the right time and the right way. State smoke management plans set the process for these burns with an aim to protect public health, but also limit the work that gets done. According to the Forest Service data, smoke management issues limited between 10 and 20% of their prescribed fire projects last year in Oregon. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about your perspectives on these issues and how we get the right balance. I also want to thank Senator Bartschiger for joining us from Oregon. He is the co-chair of the Bipartisan Fire Caucus in Oregon, has nearly 40 years of experience in wildland fire and forest management both. So thanks for flying out to be here. And just to conclude, I'd like to share a message I received from Jennifer. She's a mother in Medford, Oregon. Jennifer said, "As a native Oregonian living in Southern Oregon my entire life, I write to express my extreme frustration with Oregon's lack of forest management. This is now the 3rd or 4th year that we are hostages in our own homes, that my children are robbed of being able to play outside. I absolutely hate that nothing is done to prevent this from happening." Well, we're here to help the concerns I hear from people like Jennifer and families across my district who have one simple message: something needs to change. And in conclusion, I just got a email from a friend of mine in Medford who is on the Shakespeare board, the Oregon Shakespearean Theater board in Ashland, and they said, I have exciting news. Our safety, health, and wellness managers sent this update. We are officially closing the smoke watch that started back on July 18th and returning to normal operations. I believe they had to cancel 25 outdoor plays at the Allen Elizabethan and one for the Bomer, for a total of 26 cancellations for performances. And so this is a real bad thing for the economy. It's bad for our health. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your holding this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now would like to recognize Ms. Mary Anderson, Mobile and Area Source Program Manager, Air Quality Division, Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide some insight into how wildfires are impacting Idaho citizens. Wildfires are the single largest air pollution source in Idaho. In the past, Idaho would experience severe wildfire season with heavy localized air quality impacts every 3 to 4 years. Now we are seeing heavy regional air quality impacts every year from large, sometimes catastrophic wildfires in Idaho, Central and Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and British Columbia. These catastrophic wildfires caused by fuels that have accumulated as a result of active fire suppression, drought, and climate change. In 2017, wildfire smoke caused widespread impacts starting in early August, and by the first week of September, smoke thoroughly blanketed all of Idaho, exposing many Idaho citizens to potentially serious health impacts. About 700,000 acres were burned in Idaho in 2017. Idaho was also surrounded by wildfires, meaning wind from any direction brought smoke into the state. Nearly 5.5 million acres burned in neighboring states and British Columbia in 2017. All these fires had direct impacts on Idaho residents at one time or another throughout the wildfire season. We are seeing similar impacts this year. What I've described above is now the new norm. The public now experiences smoke impacts throughout the summer every year, with periods of very unhealthy to hazardous air quality conditions. To deal with the smoke impacts, the public wants information so they can make decisions to protect themselves, and in the case of schools, those they are responsible for. Telling them to remain indoors and limit exposure is no longer sufficient. In many cases, the air quality indoors is just as bad or worse than the air quality outside. Responding to wildfire smoke impacts requires significant resources from DEQ and other agencies throughout Idaho. To properly respond to wildfires and mitigate health impacts from smoke, the communities that are repeatedly hard hit from wildfire smoke must be made smoke ready before the smoke event occurs. This means working with communities to identify tools citizens can use to protect themselves from the smoke. An example of a smoke-ready community action is identifying the sensitive populations, such as elderly, people with lung or heart issues, and purchasing a cache of room-sized HEPA filters prior to the wildfire season so they can be distributed at the start of the emergency. Establishing a smoke-ready community must be done prior to the wildfire season in order to respond to the emergency in a timely manner. To be effective, smoke-ready communities require funding, similar to the way FireWise programs are funded. Funding for both these programs would allow communities to prepare for wildfires from both the fire safety and public health aspect. We agree that prescribed fire is an important tool in reducing fuels that contribute to catastrophic wildfire, but prescribed fire also causes smoke that needs to be managed. When prescribed fire is being discussed as a way to mitigate wildfire impacts, it's important to remember that reasonable and effective smoke management principles and decisions must be used to truly lessen smoke impacts and not simply move smoke from one time of the year to another. To manage smoke impacts from prescribed burning, the Montana-Idaho Airshed Group was created. This group implements a smoke management program for organizations that conduct large-scale prescribed burning and the agencies that regulate this burning. Burn decisions in Idaho are very much driven and limited by the weather. Northern Idaho is very mountainous. Smoke from prescribed burning can sink into the valleys and impact communities. Using best smoke management practices requires good weather that will allow the smoke to rise up high into the atmosphere and disperse so as not to impact the public. The key to this airshed group is coordinating burn requests and approvals to looking at the regional picture, not just burns on an individual basis. The airshed group uses a meteorologist to provide a weather forecast specific to prescribed burning. A coordinator evaluates all burns that are proposed, other burning and emission sources occurring in the area, current and forecasted air quality, and to determine if and how much burning can be approved. This process helps to ensure that smoke does not accumulate in valleys and impact the public. DEQ works closely with the airshed group during the active burn season. We review the weather forecast, air quality data, and proposed burns and provide recommendations to the airshed group on a daily basis. There is no short-term quick fix. We need to address all causes of wildfire and look at new innovative solutions and mitigation strategies to address the matter. The key to success will be working in partnership with all stakeholders: air quality agencies, state and federal land managers, large and small private prescribed burners, the general public, environmental groups, and others who use burning as a tool. The only way to make progress is to have an open, honest, and trusting dialogue based on facts and science. Thank you.
And the chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now will recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Congressman Pallone from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting me. I know I was on the floor with our chairman. It's been a year now since the subcommittee last held a hearing on wildfires, and since that time, the same regions of the country are suffering due to the large number and size of forest fires causing tremendous damage. And this is once again particularly destructive to western states. We've all seen the devastating images of lives lost and homes destroyed. These extreme wildfires are also creating poor air quality in states far away from the fires. Last month, the National Weather Service found that smoke from western wildfires has spread as far as New England. And these wildfires are tragic, but they should not be a surprise. For years, scientists have warned that climate change was very likely going to contribute to the increased fire intensity and frequency that we're seeing now. That's exactly what we are seeing, and we're not going to improve the situation by only looking at forest management or timber harvesting practices. If this Congress wants to truly address the increase in extreme wildfires, we must act to slow the global warming that is driving changes in climate and weather patterns. Unfortunately, the Trump administration and congressional Republicans refuse to address climate change and have instead pushed policies that will exacerbate our climate problems. Here's my list of President Trump's most significant climate actions. First, he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, giving up our spot as a global leader and turning his back on our allies. Then, he proposed to replace the common sense Clean Power Plan with a dirty power scam that lets polluters off the hook. EPA even admits this proposal will result in 1,400 more premature deaths every year. Third, President Trump proposed to relax standards for fuel efficiency in vehicles, hurting consumers and ensuring more climate-changing substances are emitted into the air. And fourth, he doubled down on a loophole in the Clean Air Act that allows more efficient and polluting heavy-duty trucks on our roadways. And then just this week, Trump relaxed controls on methane pollution from oil and gas operations and landfills. The president has also blocked all federal agencies from considering or acknowledging the costs associated with climate change when making decisions, and he has proposed to cut funds for energy-efficient programs and support for renewable energy. And finally, he continues to threaten to abuse emergency authorities to subsidize the oldest and least efficient coal plants in the country. President Trump and his administration are doing everything possible to increase emissions and block any attempt to slow the rate of climate change. The result is rising seas, extreme weather events, severe drought, and of course, extended and intense fire seasons. And these are costing lives, destroying property and infrastructure, and costing us billions in disaster assistance. And as we sit here, the Southeast is about to be hit by another powerful hurricane, devastating more communities. A new report from the researchers at Stony Brook University and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory finds that Hurricane Florence is about 50 miles wider as a result of climate change. That means the hurricane can result in 50% more rainfall. Yet Republicans refuse to address climate change. Even here today, the focus is not where it should be. How many more of these events do we need before Republicans join us in taking decisive action to combat climate change? When are Republicans going to stop actively pursuing policies that make the problem worse? If we're serious about stemming the terrible growth of the forest fire season, as well as these other natural disasters, we need to abandon the disaster that is the Trump administration climate policy, and we need to do it immediately. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you for the time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Ms. Sonia German, State Forester, Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation Forestry Division, on behalf of the National Association of State Foresters. You're welcome and recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, Full Committee Chair Walden, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. It's a true honor to be before one of the nation's longest-standing committees to discuss wildfire impacts to air quality and strategies we are undertaking to mitigate those impacts. My name is Sonia German, State Forester of Montana, and like Mr. Bogus, I am here testifying on behalf of the National Association of State Foresters. I am also a member of the Council of Western State Foresters, which represents 17 Western states and 6 U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands. I've spent my life in Montana in the past 12 years in forestry, with an emphasis on active forest management, and I'm honored to share a Montana perspective with you here today. The 2018 fire year has been challenging, not only in severity and duration, but most importantly in the number of lives lost. There have been 14 fire-related fatalities, a devastating loss to families, the wildland firefighting community, and the greater public. Across the nation, and particularly in the West, wildfires are growing more intense and so large we are now calling them megafires. In Montana, our fire season is on average 40 days longer than it was 30 years ago. And as the chairman suggested, more than 7 million acres has burned since January 1st on a national scale. And let me put that in perspective for you. In the past 16 years, we've surpassed the 7 million acre mark 8 times and the 9 million acre mark 5 times. In the 10 years prior to that, we reached 7 million acres only once. Although the 2018 fire year in Montana has thankfully been relatively moderate, our citizens and wildland firefighters are still reeling from 2017, which was our most severe season on record since 1910, with over 1.2 million acres burned, which is an area roughly the size of Delaware. With severe fire years comes intense smoke, and according to the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the air quality standards for particulate matter have been exceeded 579 times for wildfire over the past 11 years, with 214 of those occurring in 2017. Fire is a natural part of our ecosystem. What is not natural are the unprecedented forest conditions we are facing. Nearly a century of fire exclusion has led to excessive fuel loading and changed forest types. These factors, in addition to insect epidemics, persistent drought, and climate change, have resulted in a disproportionate amount of Montana's fire-adapted forests being at significant risk of wildfire. Today, over 85% of Montana's forests are at elevated wildfire hazard potential. As land managers, we understand the connection between fuels, wildfire severity, and smoke. Consequently, we make concerted efforts to work with key partners to reduce fuels that in turn reduce wildfire risk and smoke-related impacts. Treatments like prescribed fire and mechanical fuels reduction will not prevent wildfires from occurring, but can influence how a wildfire burns. Experience shows that actively managed forested stands often burn with less intensity and produce less smoke than stands with higher fuel loading. Additionally, active fuels reduction can create safer conditions for wildland firefighters and may also offer crews opportunities to keep those fires smaller. Along with our key partners, we endeavor to get more prescribed fire and mechanical fuels reduction work done on the ground. And as Ms. Anderson described, we are a part of the Montana-Idaho Airshed Group. This group assures coordinated compliance with regulatory agencies and strives to help us accomplish more prescribed burning while complying with air quality standards. In Montana, proof is in the air quality data. Over the past 11 years, prescribed fire has exceeded air quality standards only 4 times compared to 579 for wildfire. This group has been recommended as a model for other states to follow. And lastly, with over 60% of forested land in Montana managed by federal agencies, we strongly support authorities that facilitate fuels reduction projects and allow them to be completed more quickly through collaborative action. The Good Neighbor Authority and categorical exclusions for wildfire resilient projects represent two such authorities. We strongly appreciate and value Congress's efforts to make authorities like these available to our federal partners. In closing, my written testimony has been made available to you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today.
The Chair thanks you. And the Chair now turns to Mr. Colin O'Mara, President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Tonko, Chairman Walden. You have my prepared testimony. I actually want to have a kind of a real conversation today because I think, I really appreciate the topic and actually focusing on the health consequences, but the external debate on this issue has become a little ridiculous, right? Like one side saying it's all about logging and frankly just kind of cutting everything down. The other side saying it's all about climate. We need to actively manage and we actually have to address the climate stressors that are causing the system. I mean, this is a more complicated conversation. It doesn't fit into the normal kind of right-left debate. You're going to have almost unanimous agreement on this panel on 80% of the recommendations. I mean, that doesn't happen before this committee all that often, having been in the room with the chairman a handful of times. One of the missed opportunities in the fire funding fix this year, and I'm so grateful because so many of you played a constructive role in it, was delaying the funding for 2 years. To not have it take effect till 2 years, I mean, we need that money in Oregon right now. We need that money in California right now. And I get it, but leadership, when they jumped in, they didn't listen to some of you and Senator Congressman Simpson and others. It's billions of dollars of potential missed opportunity to do restoration work. And look, I mean, the appropriation minibus is already moving. It's probably too far down the list, but there has to be a way to get a slug of money because the Forest Service is basically out right now. I mean, they've hit the caps they would have hit under the limit. And if we don't get these projects on the ground, we're going to continue to have more and more of this kind of restoration deficit, if you will, that we're trying to undo because we've basically starved ourselves for 40 years, right? I mean, at least the last 25. And you're talking about a lot of funding. There's great reports. There's a great one just put out by Oregon State looking at how do we get more prescribed burns on the ground. Look, there are things we need to do with like making sure that the ambient air quality standards aren't overly prohibitive and making sure that we're accounting for the impacts of prescribed burns in a way that's actually rational and not discounting natural kind of anthropogenic emissions in a different way than we're treating man-made ones, especially if the man-made ones are going to save us 90 or 100% of emissions compared to the alternative. But most of the problem here is actually funding and collaboration. And Secretary Perdue put out a great report just a few weeks ago talking about shared stewardship, talking about how to use some of these tools that all of you put together in the last fire funding package and actually trying to get more projects on the ground. And there's things around good neighbor provisions that we absolutely have to fund. There's stewardship contracting provisions that we have to fund. There's some mechanical issues that we could work through and actually use your help, trying to make sure that the good neighbor provisions have the right accounting behind them so states are incentivized to do the work. I mean, there's some additional tools that folks like Congressman Westerman has been working on, like Chairman Barrasso and Senator Carper, some additional little tools on the management side. But this is like one of those conversations like, let's not score points on it, right? Like, folks are hurting right now. I talked to my friend who's an air director up in Oregon right now. They're trying to rewrite their their smoke plans right now. It's a good collaborative process. It's a few years too late. I would have liked to see it a few years ago. I mean, the leaders that you have on this panel actually have a lot of the solutions. And so, look, it's easy to do the talking points. You can't have this conversation without talking about climate. You got drier soils, you got less snowpack, you have warmer temperatures. I mean, the fact that it's not I'm going to steal your line, I apologize, that it's no longer a fire season, it's a fire year. This is a serious conversation. And, I know there's a lot of other votes going on, but not a lot of folks are here right now. And so I would encourage, if there's folks that want to have this conversation in a real way, and it's not just ENC, I mean, it affects natural resources, obviously you got jurisdictional issues all over the place. We got to fix the funding issue. That's the first thing. We have to figure out some of these collaborative measures and how we basically bolster the collaboratives in a big way, because the collaboratives are the way to get good products on the ground. There's a huge opportunity there, and there's some common sense things that could be fit into the Farm Bill. Advancing prescribed burns in a smart way. And there's some guidance. We don't actually need to change the Clean Air Act, but there's some guidance coming out of EPA related to how they actually measure different types of emissions that have to be fixed. I think Administrator Wheeler could get this done. I think, frankly, Gina McCarthy would have agreed with him on some of these things. This is one of those areas, again, that it's not particularly partisan. And frankly, getting those products on the ground, because right now it's easier to try to respond after the fact than it is to actually do the prescribed burn on the front end, because it's just a headache, right? The level of review that's necessary to do it is complicated. These folks do it better than most places. The folks in the Southeast are probably doing it the best right now. But there's models there that we have to figure out how to actually get off the ground, because the scale of restoration that we need is massive. I mean, we've gone from doing a few million acres a year. We need tens of millions of acres a year of active management across the board. This is a big conversation we need to have. We can't have this conversation without talking about acting on climate. I know it's a partisan issue. It shouldn't be. We need to figure out ways to reduce emissions because they are heating up these systems and making them worse. There's a big oversight role for all of you too. I do worry with the fire funding fix when it kicks in. The extra money needs to go towards restoration. It needs to go towards active restoration, active management. It can't just go to other programs. That's going to require some oversight because the way the language is written, it doesn't quite do that. And then finally, I would encourage, especially folks in the West, to try to figure out ways to get more members out to see the impacts. Because right now, I mean, I spend a lot of time in the West. I don't think folks can fully appreciate the level of devastation in the Southern California airshed, in these states. I mean, breathing the soot for day after day, this is a big issue. And at a time when we're preparing for massive hurricanes, this is the time for serious people. And I would love to work with all of you because, as the great American poet Elvis Presley said, a little less conversation, a little more action. Thank you.
Gentleman's time expired. Defending my colleagues here, I think this is actually a pretty good turnout. We do have a bill on the floor.
Sorry.
We do have a health subcommittee hearing upstairs. So this is not bad. So,
Mr. Chairman, you might point out that this is a subcommittee too, and we're in full committee. All these seats are filled as they were this morning. So just for the audience,
I would agree. Yeah, reclaiming my time. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bogus from the State Forester and Director of Texas A&M Forest Service on behalf of the National Association of State Foresters.
Thank you, Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko and Committee Chair Walden. I'm glad all of you are here, and I'm glad to be here. So to talk about this important issue today on air quality and wildfire. My name is Tom Bogus, and I'm the State Forester and Director for the Texas A&M Forest Service. I'm here to testify on behalf of the National Association of State Foresters, where I serve on the member of the Wildland Fire Committee, as well as the past president of the Southern Group of State Foresters, which represents the 13 southeastern states. I've spent 38 years in forestry and fire, and I'm honored to share some of that experience with the subcommittee today. The NASF and the regional associations like Southern Group represent the directors of the nation's state forestry agencies. We deliver technical and financial assistance along with fire and resource protection to more than 2/3 of our nation's 766 million acres of forest land. We do this with critical partnerships and with investments from the federal government, including U.S. Forest Service state and volunteer fire assistance grants, which provide equipment and training to the firefighters who respond to state and private land, where over 80% of our nation's wildfires begin. This has been a heck of a year across the country. You've heard that, and in Texas was no exception. We had over 8,000 wildfires, burning over 500,000 acres so far in 2018. The fire activity impacts responders at local, state, and national levels. The first impact is to communities, and what many people don't understand and realize is that in Texas, 75% of our wildfires occur within 1 mile of a community. Most of these fires, historically 91%, are suppressed by the local responders. The other 9%, when their capacity is exceeded, require local, state, and often national resources to control. Wildfires affect us all. I don't care whether you're rural or urban, local or state or national. At the state and national level, demand to respond does not go away, and you just heard from my colleague here that in the wildfire community, we've quit using fire season, and we've started using fire year because it's much more accurate because there's a wildfire season somewhere, and the wildfires are happening somewhere across America at any time. Fire has always been a natural part of the ecosystem in Texas and the South and really a lot of parts of the country. However, for many reasons, wildfires have become increasingly detrimental to the forests and communities around them, including the generation of catastrophic amounts of air pollutants. That's why we're here today. So what can we do to address the massive amounts of wildfire smoke? My state forester colleagues and I put a great deal of emphasis on proactive prescribed burning. During the times of year when fire risk is low, you've already heard it, where fire size and smoke emissions and community notification can be managed effectively as compared to an unplanned or an often catastrophic wildfire. In the southern part of the country, we have a long history of getting prescribed fire accomplished on the ground. We have formed a fire management committee in the states consisting of a fire director from each of the 13 states, and we work together on shared practices, best management practices. For example, we created the Southern Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal, or SouthWrap, and it's especially important in an urbanizing state like Texas. We build and maintain strong partnerships with landowners and local governments in implementing partnerships with state environmental quality agencies, federal land management agencies to get prescribed burning done and forest management done collaboratively. In Texas, unlike the West, 94% of our land is privately owned and prescribed fires primarily conducted by private landowners. Texas is a big and diverse state, and the reasons for conducting prescribed burning are just as diverse as our geography. We recently developed a state smoke management plan to provide best management practices for our landowners and these cooperators and certified burners. The plan provides resources for these professionals to utilize in order to minimize the smoke from their prescribed burns. Environmental regulations, such as air quality, are under the authority of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCEQ. Now, they're also, that's a great conversation and education process, but they're a great partner, and they understand, and they have said last week at a hearing in state that we need more fire on the ground in Texas, and more prescribed fire and not less. So once again, I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify and appear before you. I look forward to answering any questions, and if I can share more expertise that we have in Texas and the South related to wildfire, hazardous fuel reduction, and prescribed burning. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Seeing no other members of the panel, I'd like to recognize myself 5 minutes to start the round of questions. And Mr. Mayor, I want to go with you just because of your opening statement. And I think you alluded to a missed opportunity in the minibus and I know you can fill the space.
Yeah, no.
Briefly tell me what was the missed opportunity.
Yeah, so in the fire funding fix that was passed in March as part of the big budget deal, there was a provision that was stuck into 3 a.m. that basically moved it from being 2018 fiscal year to 2020 fiscal year. There's no increased funding through the fire fix for the next fiscal year. So you're not going to have the additional money that you all passed for 14 more months. There's some supplemental money that folks here and Udall and Murkowski put in, but the actual tool isn't available when we're having these horrible conditions.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go to Ms. Anderson and Ms. Gurman. Compare and contrast for me the risk challenges and the environmental quality aspects of a forest fire and the resulting smoke and stuff versus auto emissions and coal-fired power plants.
So in Idaho, we don't have any coal-fired power plants. The next biggest emitter are, we do have quite a bit of open burning. We have agricultural burning, backyard burning, a lot of auto emissions. We don't have a lot of industry in Idaho. So by far, the wildfire emissions are the biggest air pollution source that we just can't manage. We have to react to.
Ms. Gurman.
Yes, thank you. I lack the specifics on any type of coal emissions, but I can say anecdotally, certainly wildfire smoke is by far the largest polluter within the state.
Great. Let me go to Mr. Boggess. In your testimony, you say that, and I quote, "Our forests are currently more fire prone than ever." I think Mr. O'Meara may have alluded to that. Some of the opening statements would. Why do you believe that's the case?
We need more active management, and I think several people on the committee have alluded to that. And I think when you have a built-up of fuel, and what we haven't even really talked about is the land use changes that have happened. We've got more people living in and around our forest, but the fuel loads are increasing every year.
And when you use that terminology, just for the fuel load is increasing, what are you referring to?
There's more to burn, available to burn in the woods than there ever has been.
So, Mr. O'Meara, I'm not picking on him. I mean, he mentioned the threat of clear cutting. We're not talking about clear cutting large swaths of ground. We're talking about what?
No, and we're talking about active management, forest management of the resource, and
removing some of this
does mean
fuel.
harvesting. That does mean thinning, but that means keeping forests healthy. And I have great examples, and we won't have time to get into them, but examples in Texas where managed forest, even if you have severe drought or you have wildfires, the managed forest bear better, and you don't have the damage, catastrophic damage that you do to wildlife habitat and resources that you do with unmanaged forest.
Yeah, let me go to Mr. Barshiger first, the senator. I'm sorry, and for that same question.
Well, from a fire science perspective, you always have to remember you have to have drying of the fuels to a point where they can be ignited and sustain ignition, and you have to have ignition. You can have the driest and even huge fuel loadings, and if you don't have ignition, you have no fire. And so when I talk about the human element, that's something that I've been tracking now for about 10 years of really looking at it. So we're having more and more of these fires that are caused by the human element. And when we get more and more fires, then we spread our resources and we can't concentrate on putting one out because it's kind of like whack-a-mole, you know?
Right. Of the fires that, all the fires we're experiencing, percentage-wise, how much are natural caused and how many are caused by human intervention? And a fire not left or we've had some intentional?
Yeah, and when I refer to human cause, I'm not talking about an arsonist. I'm talking about it can be a power line failure. It can be a chain dragging from a vehicle down the road. It's something that has to do with a human, that we wouldn't have that fire if we didn't have that human element into it. And it's getting close to 9 out of 10 fires.
Okay, great. My time is close to be expiring. I'll turn to the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, welcome to all of our witnesses, and thank you for your expert testimony. And Mr. O'Mara, you made the observation that a great many of us agree about the severity of the problem and the need to move forward. And I'm hoping that somehow we can be inspired to come up with solutions that incorporate the professionals that manage these resources in such an outstanding manner. I want to start with a big picture question before we get into the specifics on forest management. How important is addressing climate change, which we know contributes to conditions that exacerbate the number and severity of these fires, for our long-term fire mitigation and our forest management strategy?
Look, we have to address the underlying stressors of the system long-term. Those aren't improvements that'll happen overnight. There's a lot of things we have to do in the near term, but if we want to have long-term kind of sustainable health, we have to kind of bend the curve on the warming planet.
And in March, Congress passed the fiscal year 18 Omnibus Appropriations Bill, which included changes to how we fund the United States Forest Service's fire response beginning in 20, and you alluded to that funding. Does everyone agree it is important to provide greater funding for more proactive forest management to reduce the risks of these large wildfires?
Absolutely. I think the more that we can do, to my colleague's point about thinking about private lands, state lands, federal lands, these are the same landscapes, even though the ownership might be different. And I do think providing additional funding for certain tools like prescribed burns could be very effective. I actually don't think that the fix itself is going to end up being sufficient long-term, even just given the scale of the, we're talking another 10 million acres this year, probably by the time we're done. We're escalating in a pretty concerning way, and I think you're going to need more money, frankly, not less. So
is that the additional work that we need to secure here, or is there something more than just the dollars that are required as we go forward with the fix?
From my point of view, I think there are additional tools that we can provide. I think there are some very important tools that were provided as part of the funding fix in March. A few of the ones that just kind of come to mind, top of mind, is there's like the Collaborative Forest Landscape Program. That's a very effective tool that's in the current draft of the Farm Bill, assuming that gets done. There's some things around funding disease and infestation. There's things around Good Neighbor Authority, like I mentioned, making sure that works for everybody, including tribes, including other partners, counties in some cases that are bigger. There's some innovation programs for trying to have markets for some of these products, because one of the worries I have is that if we don't create robust markets, and trade comes into this, because a lot of the timber guys are struggling right now because the markets are closing in China in particular. And so there's a bigger conversation with the economic consequences, making sure there's a place to put this material into good use.
Thank you. And based on the recommendations of NWF's Megafires report, do you have other suggestions on how Congress and the administration can help reduce the threat of wildfires?
I would encourage this committee to convene some of the stakeholders, some of the agency heads that are involved. Secretary Perdue and his team have done a really nice job, acting director administrator, or Christensen, and Jim Hubbard. I think pulling together some folks at EPA and having conversations about how we encourage more prescribed burns in a way that are protective of public health, having some more clear guidance could be helpful. And then also highlighting the success of particularly the Montana-Idaho collaborative event, because I do think that's a model that could be replicated in other places. There's a good collaborative in California as well that could be replicated. But we have to elevate these best practices in other places because we're going to see the impacts get worse over time.
And a few people have mentioned forest provisions included in the House Farm Bill, H.R. 2. Although there have been criticisms that they go too far in undermining environmental laws, including NEPA and the Endangered Species Act. Do you have any thoughts on those provisions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to provide additional detail, kind of point by point on them. I think there's a series of them that are very bipartisan. I think there are a few that probably go a little too far in some of the categorical exclusions. You know, we probably should be using the ones that we have right now. I think the one that was passed before was the most important one from March. And I think, you know, the more that those conversations are being directed by the science and by the experts, the better. But I do think there's a suite of 4 or 5 of them easily can move through this Farm Bill. And I'd love to work with you offline to tell you exactly which ones those are.
Sure. I appreciate that. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Time chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to my colleagues for participating in this hearing and to all our witnesses for being here today. I want to talk about some of the issues that we've run into, some of the data that we have. According to the Georgia Institute of Technology, when they did a study on this, found that wildfires burning more than 11 million acres spew as much carbon monoxide into the air as all the cars and factories in the continental U.S. during those same months. I'm sorry, that was California Forestry Association. You're probably familiar with these data points. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC's 4th assessment report on mitigation, said in 2007, quote, in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained carbon mitigation benefit. So basically, healthy green forests sequester carbon. Dead, dying, old ones, and ones that burn and reburn actually emit carbon. So one of the provisions in the Farm Bill is something that we do on those other landscapes you referenced, Mr. Romero, and that is after a fire, you harvest the burned dead trees where it makes sense, and you replant a new green forest which will sequester carbon. Is that one of the provisions you oppose, your organization opposes or supports?
No, we've been supportive
of the House Farm Bill provision.
And the only thing, we just want to make sure we're planting kind of smartly, right, in terms of what's going to be sustainable in the long term. Oh, no, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, because it will be the forest, the types of trees for that area and the environment and all that. I mean, you got to do it. We got to be smart about it. But what I hear, and Senator, you may want to speak to this because you've both been on the forest management side and had a career on the forest firefighting side, so you've seen both. Tell me what happens in these fires the second go-around after the trees on federal ground have not been removed, the burned dead ones. What happens there when a fire breaks out the second time, which often is the case?
Well, on Forest Service lands, they're not going to replant after a fire. So when you have the first fire go through, the mortality rate of the live trees is pretty high. The second time or the third time it goes through, it takes out the rest of the trees. So there's no trees to cone out. Cone out means when a tree is starting to die, they'll drop cones and reseed and start all over again. But after the second or third burn, there's no trees to do that. And so it changes the entire ecosystem of that forest. You will not have the same forest that you had. And that's what we're seeing in the dirt. Yeah, I mean, catastrophic high-density fire.
This is the dirt that remains, which is called ash.
Yeah.
And on the second fire, doesn't it make it even harder to maintain any kind of vegetation frequently because it burns the soils, it sterilizes the soil so deeply?
Our common terminology is it nukes the soil.
Nukes the soil. How far down will it nuke the soil in a bad fire?
It just depends how hot it gets. And in Southern Oregon, Northern California, where we have extremely high fuel loadings, in other words, tons per acre, we have a very hot fire. We can have 400-foot flames from some of those fires.
400 feet high.
400 feet high, the flames. So depending on the severity, the hotter the fire, the deeper it's going to go into the soil. It can go pretty deep.
Mr. Romero, I fully agree with you on the need to solve the fire borrowing issue. I have been an advocate of doing that from day one. It makes no sense. I'm told there are statistics that show it costs 4 to 5 times as much to fight a fire as it does to do the kind of work you and I agree needs to be done on the forest. I had somebody in Region 6 Forest Service at one point tell me 70% of the Forest Service budget for these projects goes into planning and appeals. And it seems like we've got a broken process then if all the money's going into the planning and not going to the ground. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I think there's two issues there. One is that, I think there is some redundancy in the planning process. There's some things that could be streamlining. We're not bolstering the collaboratives enough. If folks go through a collaborative process, there should be a way to make sure. I was a co-sponsor
of that legislation, do the landscape scale collaboratives that we're using in Oregon today.
Right.
And I think you said something too about we got to do bigger expanses on these collaboratives, right, or on the treatment because we're millions of acres behind. One of the other provisions in the Farm Bill would extend the categorical exclusions out to 6,000 acres. We've got millions we need to do. 3,000 is currently on the books, but only on certain forests in certain states if certain governors identified certain lands. So in southern Oregon, where the senator's from, our governor didn't designate any of those lands. But the provisions in the Farm Bill in the House would allow for a 6,000 acre CE where you could go in and begin this catch-up work. And so I'm hopeful we can get that into law. Our committee, while we want to believe we have complete jurisdiction over every issue on the books in the Congress, and I think we'd be better off if we did, doesn't fully have Forest Service jurisdiction. But this is our hook because what's happening on our federal lands is dramatically, dangerously affecting the health of our citizens, and that's why linking to the air quality is so critical. Did you want to respond more?
Just one thing. To your point on the carbon emissions.
Yeah.
20 to 30% of the global solution could come from repairing these kind of natural systems.
Absolutely.
Right? It could be 10 to 15% of this country. When you're talking about the impacts just of the forest fires the last few years, you're talking 30 to 60 million cars, right? This is one of the most potentially bipartisan ways we restore our forests, we reduce emissions. It's a win for everybody.
And you haven't talked about the habitat, the water quality, et cetera, et cetera. My time's expired. The chairman's been very generous. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman's always generous to the chairman. So Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Dr. Reeves, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And Chairman, I agree with you that this is a definite public health concern. And there's two main points. One is that it is a public health concern. Just recently in the fires in my district, I had to give a warning on social media to anybody who can smell smoke or see ash, especially vulnerable populations, the older, the young, and people with lung illnesses, that they should be inside in a closed air conditioning unit. The second main point that this tells us is that these fine particles, particle matter 2.5 microns, and substance from a fire in California can travel all clear across the country. So whether you're in a fire-prone state or not, it is an American issue, and all of our public healths can be in jeopardy. As we sit here today, there are 17 active wildfires burning across the state of California. The ongoing wildfire season has resulted in over 1.4 million acres burned, and the worst is likely yet to come due to climate change, because we know that climate change can fuel the severity, frequency, and the size of wildfires by increasing the duration of droughts, causing long stretches of low humidity and high temperatures, and initiating early springtime melting, which leads to drier lands in summer months. So we need to address and recognize climate change and do everything possible, or else we're not being as effective as we can. In August, the Cranston Fire burned over 13,000 acres in my district outside of the community of Idlewild. This fire exposed the residents of those mountain communities to numerous risks beyond just the flames themselves. While the fire burned, residents across Southern California were subjected to increased air pollution as the smoke traveled across the region. These are kids with asthma, elders with COPD, people with pulmonary fibrosis, etc. We're having more shortness of breath, visiting emergency departments requiring more intensive care. The smoke and pollution from wildfires can affect populations far removed from these fires themselves. The fires in California can cause vast clouds of hazardous smoke that can affect the air quality for residents in Arizona, Nevada, and even further east. So wildfires are regional disasters with national implications. And earlier this year, my Wildfire Prevention Act was signed into law, which extended the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to any fire that receives a Fire Management Assistance Grant. Previously, this funding was only available to declared major disasters and not fire. Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds may be used to fund projects that will help prevent and mitigate future fires. So examples can include reseeding, construction of barriers, hazardous fuel reduction, or reinstalling ground cover. So, Mr. O'Mara, can you speak to examples of mitigation projects that can be taken in the wake of wildfires that would be most helpful to preventing a repeat event?
Yeah, and this is one of those great examples of an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cause. I mean, look, there are things we can do on the landscape. We've talked a lot about prescribed burns. We've talked a lot about active management practices that are ecologically sound, but there's also some common sense, right? I mean, we're building further and further into the wildland-urban interface, right? I mean, you have folks that are building up into the hills, you know, in your district. I mean, there's some common sense that we're putting people in harm's way, and I do think that there has to be some kind of accounting for that and making sure we're not putting additional folks in harm's way. And it's unfortunate in some cases. These are beautiful places. But, you know, we allow, you know, people's kind of desire to live in the middle of the woods.
So what are some examples, specific examples that households can do and that we can do as policymakers?
Sure. So there are things on building codes, making sure for more fire resistant products and things like that. And some states have done that, or some local governments. There's things around siting that can be incredibly helpful. Making sure climate science is part of your planning process. You know, so there are a wide range of things that have people in less harm's way.
So, Ms. German, as a state forester, can you give examples of how you would use additional hazard mitigation funds to prevent future wildfire damage?
Yes, thank you. I can think of several, and I'll speak specifically to working on private lands. Any funding that we get through state and private forestry, we're targeting lands within the wildland-urban interface to work with landowners to reduce the fuels in and around their homes and educate them on things like the home ignition zone. And we're finding that a lot of fires, you know, they also start, homes also burn because of the expanse around the home. If they're not necessarily going to be planting fire-resistant material or shrubs, we try to work with people to educate them on the best type of landscaping that they can have. So it's going to take a couple of things: fuels reduction outside of that home ignition zone, and also work within and around homes.
It's amazing to see the photos of the houses that were spared because of what they did around their house to mitigate the propagation of fires. It works, definitely works. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Congressman McKinley from West Virginia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And unfortunately, the ranking member from New Jersey has left, but I wanted to thank him for his opening statement, because it gave us, those that are here, a little snapshot of what life could be like after November. If he becomes the chairman. The diatribe of challenging President Trump for everything on climate change, it just shows that such a distraction that's going to take place in this committee in the years ahead when we try to deal with all the matters that come before this committee. And perhaps it was just meant to be a distraction from the economic resurgence that's taken place across this country. And I appreciate you, Senator from Oregon, that you didn't blame President Trump for one of those 9 of 10 fires being started, because he got blamed for waters rising in the oceans, blaming Hurricane Florence. It's just inexcusable, but that's what we're going to see. So it was a little vignette of what we might be able to see in the future. My question, or my further with the remarks, would be we had some discussion a couple years ago about the CO2 emissions out in the atmosphere. And I quoted O'Mara, I quoted from Al Gore's book, that the largest producer of CO2s into the atmosphere is not from coal. It's coming from the deforestation of our tropical rainforests. So the idea of what we're seeing in California, Oregon, and elsewhere is we're contributing to this. That's why we need to address those problems and those solutions, so that we're not allowing this uncontrolled burn in our forests and allow that to take place. Now, I go to West Virginia, and there we have the MON, which is about 1 million acres. But I got to say, Mr. O'Mara, with all due respect, it's been groups like yours and others that have prevented the logging in the MON forest, that it's 1 million acres and they've only received about $1 million worth of harvest. Think about that. $1 per acre is all they're getting out of that forest. But yet you go to the Allegheny forest in Pennsylvania and it's getting $12 per acre. So we think about what the situation is we have in the MON. I want to learn from what testimony's been given here, that we may be sitting on something that's a very aging forest in West Virginia, in the Mon, and it's a tinderbox because people are preventing us from logging and perfecting the situation that we have in West Virginia. So I'm looking to some guidance at how we might be able to approach this, because I'm afraid we're going to start experiencing the same problem in West Virginia, in the Mon, that you all were experiencing out west, because of environmental groups do not want to have. I've got here, the West Virginia legislature was trying to do some in the state forest, but the environmental groups prevented that from happening. What advice can you give us for other areas? We've seen the devastation, and we've seen the collection that the chairman has of soot from out west. What do we do? How do we prevent that from happening in the east as well? What would you suggest, any of you? Don't be shy. There's nothing we can learn.
And Representative, is the question, what would we do with
what
active
would you
forest
recommend?
management?
Should we go about this? Because the national forest, because the environmental movement is preventing us from thinning that and addressing the problem. We're only getting 1/12 of the wood products out of the Mon that people are getting in other national forests. It's becoming a nursing home for wood.
Sure. And if I may, I think something that is happening right now, and I think you see it through the panel and Mr. O'Mara and my colleague Mr. Boggess, we're talking about a lot of the same things, and I think there's an opportunity that is happening right now. Is we're all interested as land managers and as people who are interested in getting restoration, protecting water quality and air quality. We are wanting to focus on taking a cross-boundary approach. So we call it all lands, all hands. I think that's something that we talk about across the nation. But we have this opportunity right now to be doing more, but we have to be making sure that we're not only going to be doing more on private lands, we have to have the funding through our agencies for state and private forestry within our states. Other things like Good Neighbor Authority. So it's an excellent partnership between the federal government and the states, working with collaboratives, working with local government.
And all due respect, those are great ideals, but it's not happening. So maybe Anita Boggess, what would you suggest? What do we have to do to try to encourage the Forest Service to eliminate these hazards so that we don't experience the same problem?
Well, you have to keep the dialogue open, and we are an early adapter. Texas is an early adapter for the Good Neighbor Authority, where you have these agreements. Even before there was Good Neighbor Authority, we went into agreement with our national forest folks in Texas, and to help them with prescribed burning. We had an agreement in 2007 and 8 for that. Then we had the Good Neighbor Authority, which means the states can help the U.S. Forest Service get management done on their lands. And y'all's thank you for the fire fix, and it's been said before, but that's a great help to us, because a lot of times the money we have and for reaching and technical assistance and the money that a lot of people don't talk about is the state and private funding that comes from where the borrowing came from state and private often, and so that was where we can reach out and do more with on U.S. Forest Service lands, but also on technical assistance and helping the state and the private landowners across the state, which you heard was most of the forest land in this country is on, and where you're talking about the east and the south, is on private lands, and those folks need technical assistance. And so these programs like stewardship, urban and community forestry, and the Good Neighbor Authority help us put things not just in a plan, but put them on the ground and manage and make our forest healthier.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I know some of you were worried there weren't a lot of members here, but you had members representing the entire Rocky Mountain West and West Coast. So that's pretty darn good, because we're the ones dealing with these issues every day. I just want to say I think Mr. O'Mara is correct. We don't have any silver bullet for solving this problem. You know, being from Colorado, I see this firsthand, and believe you me, you know, we couldn't see the Front Range for most of August in Denver because of the smoke. Then I went to Oregon, and the same smoke was in Oregon, and then I went up to Vancouver, and it was still there for a month. And this is not normal summer weather for us in the West. The thing we have to realize is there's no one solution. It would be super great if we could just go in and clear out all of this extra wood, and then we wouldn't have as big of a fire risk. But number one, that's not the best management technique for a lot of these areas. But number two, for those of you who are not from the Rocky Mountain West and West, it's millions and millions of acres that we're talking about. There is no way, even if we had adequate funding, we could go in and clear out this wood. Secondly, in some of these areas, we really do need to have prescribed burns. We need to have forest management programs that are appropriate for those forests. And I'm delighted to see our whole panel sitting here today agreeing with these concepts. So what can we do? There's a couple of things. Number one, several of you said we have to have adequate funding. And this is a bipartisan issue for those of us from the West, where our colleagues don't seem to understand how important funding is for forest management, no matter what those techniques are. The second thing is we have to think about long-term planning. We are not going to be able to solve this air quality issue or the other related issues without the long-term planning. Mr. Amari, you talked about the dry soils, the water, and everything else from climate change, but there's other issues too. Let's see if they have my picture, if the clerk has my picture to put up. This is a picture that I took in the Pike San Isabel National Forest last month. It's always really fun to go hiking with me because I stopped and said, take a look at this forest. See the trees on the ground? Those trees would not have been on the ground 10 years ago. That's ponderosa pine. It was all killed by the pine beetle. And they died and they fell down on the forest floor. Then you can see the aspens now that have grown up because of the death of the pine forest. But then if you look closely, you can see the new baby ponderosa pines growing up. So this is something the forest has tried to do to naturally recover from the pine beetle infestation. We in Colorado, we think it's a miracle that all of these millions of acres that look like this have not burned. We have had some devastating fires the last few years, but we did not have devastating fires this year. I don't know why. I think probably luck. But if you want to solve this problem, so these could all be burning. Now we all said in Colorado, we need to be able to remove this dead ponderosa pine, and we did in many areas. But it's millions of acres. It's wilderness areas. It's national forests. It's BLM land. So we have to think of ways where we're going to aggressively address climate change issues, because it's not just the carbon emissions that we're seeing and everything else. It's a whole ecosystem that's impacted. So I just really want to say, Mr. Chairman, I so appreciate you having this hearing, and I think that there are ways that we can aggressively work in a bipartisan way. But to think we can go down and clear out all the dead wood or just have a few controlled burns, that's not going to solve this problem over this entire massive and beautiful region. Thanks, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this has been an enlightening panel today. Mr. Vargas, I have a couple of questions for you, if we could. We've got something called Good Neighbor Authority, and we've had several people mention that, but nobody's described it. Can you describe Good Neighbor Authority for us?
It's I guess the easiest answer is it's a partnership and agreement we go into with the U.S. Forest Service, where they often have either lost the expertise or do not have the personnel available to help them with timber sales, with prescribed burning, and now you've added road building in the latest version, into there to help with the management activities on the U.S. Forest Service lands. And so we go in partnership with them and help them manage their the federal assets, the federal forest.
Okay. And how does this authority work for the state of Texas? You as the chief forestry officer in the state, how does that work for you?
It's a dialogue that has to go on, and it's something you learn as you go. Like I said, we were an early adapter. We saw the benefits of this. In Texas, Again, we're a private property state. The U.S. Forest Service has only 635,000 acres of forest land in Texas, but that is extremely important because the things that happen on that forest impact the private landowners around the forest. And so with insects and disease, with fire and so forth. And so we work with them because we want to help and make sure there are some other programs, like we had the Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program, is federal funding through the U.S. Forest Service, that we would help with those private landowners get their property thinned and managed around, we kind of call it beetle proofing, around the U.S. Forest Service lands. But we also now, with Good Neighbor Authority, we can work with the U.S. Forest Service partners and get those same, on the inside of the red paint, and get those lands protected as well and help do some thinning and keep their forest healthy. And that's the whole idea. We want to keep our forest healthy.
Okay, great, thanks. And in your testimony, you mentioned that last year Texas used prescribed fires on over 200,000 acres, and that and you also said that burning like this is pretty common across the South. Some states even do higher amounts of prescribed burning. What are the challenges that exist with, well, let me rephrase the question. What are the challenges of dealing with prescribed burns versus the challenges of dealing with uncontrolled burns?
A wildfire is much more challenging and much more destructive. Now, prescribed fire or controlled burn, it says what it is. It's prescriptive. You have a very set weather parameters. It's lower intensity. And so you have much less particulate matter, and what it does is it fireproofs communities, it fireproofs the area, so it keeps a catastrophic wildfire from happening. It prevents that fire. You're almost like saying fighting fire with fire, because you're making it where the fuel loading is less. You're keeping those forests. It's a fire ecosystem in Texas, right. So we're keeping those forests and those lands healthy. And keeping the fuel loading down. So if you were to have a wildfire breakout, an uncontrolled, unplanned fire breakout through there, it would be much less destructive.
And then you also do this adjacent to communities in order to protect those communities from the impact of a wildfire. What do you do to protect the community in the controlled burn process?
Well, obviously, the biggest thing we do, and I guess I'll give an example, is our Jones State Forest in Texas, which is in the city, almost in the city limits of Houston. Mm-hmm. So it's surrounded by subdivision. So it's a very difficult place to burn. So we have to plan, and part of these things is working with our environmental quality folks, and also working with the community around there, landowners and homeowners around there, for them to understand if they do have breathing issues, when we're going to do it, and so there's a lot of communication back and forth with those homeowners and landowners to say, here's what's going to happen. And at first, if they're not used to, if they're urbanized and urban dwellers, they're not used to seeing smoke. Sure. If you didn't grow up in the country and burning your leaves and seeing smoke, well, it's disturbing. They think it's a wildfire, and so we let them know what's going to happen, and we also show them before and after and the benefits of that fire, that prescribed fire. And now some of our biggest advocates are the ones that say, yes, if you have anybody that's against prescribed fire, tell them to call me. Uh-huh. And so we have a lot of peers that will help and come to our defense, landowners and homeowners. So you've got to do a lot of outreach with the group, and you've got to do a lot of preparation and planning ahead of time. And so the weather has to be right, conditions have to be right, so that the smoke can not be an adverse condition for those homeowners and landowners around the fire.
Right, and of course, one of the ways that the prescribed burns are safer is you do it during seasons when you're less likely to have any
Absolutely.
Have it migrate into an uncontrolled burn. I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question. A controlled burn has an environmental impact. A wildfire has a huge environmental impact. So because a controlled burn has an environmental impact, you have to work with the Texas CEQ on that. Describe that relationship and how you go
and that's
about
an
doing
ongoing relationship, and that is one of the things we hope to get done, and we just started 2 years ago working with them to look at their rules. We would like to see prescribed fire treated differently than a wildfire, than smokestacks, than car emissions. It ought to have some lesser, because of the good it does, and it will help in the long term prevent catastrophic particulate matter with a wildfire. So we would like to see the TCEQ treat prescribed burning, and those that are done it by trained, certified prescribed fire managers, not just anybody, but that they would have a look at the smoke and emissions from a prescribed fire differently than they do. We're not there yet, but we're having those conversations. And like I said last week, the chair of the TCEQ said, you know, we need to have more prescribed fire on the ground in Texas, not less. And so we're getting there.
And thank you. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll ask you to respond supplementally to those. We'll send those to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. This is certainly a, a serious problem, particularly in the state of Georgia. Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the nation. As you know, we have over 22 million acres of privately owned land and only about 1.7 million acres of government land. So we're a little bit different from, I think, the scenario that exists out west. However, we've had our share of fires. We had the West Memphis fires. The Okefenokee Swamp is in my district. It is truly one of the national treasures of our country. It is a beautiful, beautiful area that I've had the opportunity to visit on numerous occasions. But we had a very serious fire there this past year, the West Memphis fire. And one of the adjacent property owners to that was telling me about this, and I met with him because he lost a lot of land as a result of the fire that started on the swamp but spread to his private land. And I'll start with you, Mr. Bearchigger, because I see that you worked as a fire training instructor and a national Type 3 incident commander. And I just wanted to ask you, one of the things that was brought to my attention by the private landowner was that they didn't utilize the air support. If they had been able to utilize it quicker, that they could have contained it possibly. Now, in all fairness, a swamp fire is a little bit different than other kind of fires because you have from what I understand, and I know y'all know it a lot better than I do, but the peat moss and it's hard to put out because the water has to rise up. And again, you understand it much better than I do, but he did make that point that if and he attributes it to being a problem with whether it was low funding and they couldn't afford to utilize the air support, the helicopters that were available. Is this something that you've experienced before?
Well, there could be, I wasn't there.
Right.
I don't know what the conditions were, and certain tools work good under certain conditions. If you have a wind blowing in excess of, say, 20 miles an hour, aviation stuff really doesn't help you much. And swamp is tough because you can't use dozers and other mechanical equipment because they don't go through the swamp very well. So there's challenges with every fire. But the example you give is very good, is every forest in this country is exposed to catastrophic wildfire. And our history shows that, going back to 1812 with the great Maine and New Brunswick fire. Who would have thought that northern Maine and Brunswick would burn up, I think it was 3 million acres and kill a lot of people. So, it's hard for me to comment on a fire that I don't have any specifics, but not all the tools work all the time, sir. And in Oregon this year, landowners lost 33,000 acres of private timberlands from fires burning off of the Forest Service onto the private lands.
Well, let me ask you, I met with him, as I mentioned before, and he owns a lot of forest land in the area in Georgia. And when I met with him, he said that, a lightning strike is what this originated from, and that generally the federal government will just let it burn out and not even respond to it. Is that?
It just depends where it is, and if it's, I believe you mentioned it was in a wilderness.
Yeah, it was in the middle of the swamp, or at least it started. Now it spread, onto the private land.
In wilderness comes certain engagement rules, and I think some of that needs to be reviewed.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Let me move to. I wanted to get to Ms. German. I'm sorry, Ms.
German. Yeah.
German. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Okay. I wanted to ask you. Now you're in Montana, right?
Yes.
Okay. The practices in Montana, I suspect, are a little bit different than as I described in the state of Georgia, particularly in the swamp. And I ask about that in my district. Now, we're not all swamp in Georgia, but in my district we are. I'm in South Georgia. So, but I wanted to ask you about the practice, the forestry practices that you have in Montana. Can you describe those very quickly?
Sure, absolutely. So we have I'll say that 60% of the forested land within the state of Montana is managed by the Forest Service. And we have active forest management taking place on state, private, and federal lands. And anything else that you want to know?
I wanted to ask
that?
you specific about the state implementation plans. And I guess this is kind of a broad question. I'm out of time, but nevertheless, these have to be approved by the EPA. Is that the way I understand it?
Yeah, and I don't have extra expertise on the state implementation plans. I might ask that my colleague from Idaho asked.
I was just wondering if there are any kind of barriers that you're having or any kind of constraints, and how soon do they approve those? How quickly do they approve them?
Quickly, please.
Yeah, it normally takes an 18-month period for EPA to approve those. So any changes to like Idaho rules, we submit for EPA. It's a very long, drawn-out process.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having this hearing. Hopefully we can see through the smoke of politics and get things a little bit more right than not in this great country. Don't we have some of the best response systems in the world? I mean, aren't we like in the upper tier when it comes to being able to respond to fires and try to protect life and property? I think everybody pretty much agrees with that. I'm not saying we're the best, but we're definitely the upper tier, right? We've got all that capacity and capability, thank God. But one thing I'd like to point out is that, you know, the wildfires that have been ravaging through California are in excess of anything we've ever seen in the past. For example, 25 years ago, if you had a 4,000-acre fire, that was considered big. Now we have these mega fires that are consuming over 100,000 acres per fire. And then all of a sudden you have now where people talked about fire season. It's kind of like fire year now. There really isn't a 3 or 4 or 5 month season now. Now it's the situation is so bad, so dire. Our forests and our vegetation have dried up so much that it's the honest to God truth, as they say, you know, protect yourself and hope and pray that there's not a fire, because there is no season anymore. It could erupt at any given time. And then when it does, we see these mega fires, and some of them are raging as we speak. Another thing as well, I'd just like to point out that this is a responsibility that we need to hopefully get right as policymakers and as organizations, whether it's local or state or federal. We need to make sure that we can work together to minimize the negative effects of these devastating fires. For example, according to the U.S. Forest Service alone, they've spent $2 billion last year just with the fires. That doesn't include the economic loss, et cetera. That's just the federal investment in that. And I truly do believe that we can always do better if we take the opportunity to learn from the past, to learn about what's going on today, to learn about what it is that, how we're gonna deal with this issue that many scientists are claiming that, you know, from some of our finest universities, Columbia University, et cetera, are saying that, you know, climate change is in fact contributing tremendously to some of the fires that are going on today. I hope we don't argue about the simple fact that we do have a different environment now when it comes to the vegetation, when it comes to the ability to, for Mother Nature to protect itself, and we as human beings have to make up the difference. Again, 4,000 square foot fire, 4,000 acre fire not too long ago was considered big. 100,000 acre fire is now becoming commonplace. So with that, I'd like to also ask the chair and the ranking member, coming from California, you know, in the future, if we could try to glean through the wonderful experts like the ones we have here today, maybe we can get somebody from California up here, because, you know, our disproportionality of being affected by fires as of late is just tremendous. Again, I don't know if that's a complaint or what have you. I think it's an observation with 5 members from the California delegation on the subcommittee. hopefully in the future we can be a little bit more cognizant.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, absolutely.
You do know the process by which it's the people who are asked are both from the majority and the minority side.
And that's why I mentioned to both of you.
Okay, I just want to make sure it's clear.
The chair and the ranking member. But since you brought it up, maybe it's a 4-to-1, because we get one person and you get 4.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'll yield.
Yeah, these negotiations are always done between the parties, and I've seen no objection.
Okay, thank you. So again, that's why I said it's not so much a complaint, it's just an observation, and hopefully we can get fortunate enough to have some folks who are dialed in directly within the California scene, especially since it's one of the most dire in the country now when it comes to our fires. Mr. O'Mara, what will the effect beyond California fire seasons, or as I just called it, fire years, actually, if we continue to roll back clean air standards?
I mean, the challenge is that, as the fires get worse, they're displacing a lot of the air quality benefits that we've accumulated through cleaner power plants, cleaner cars, energy efficiency, all the work that you're doing at the state level. I actually worked for the mayor of San Jose for 3 years. And, a lot of the work that they've been doing, right, has been, you could undo a lot of that progress unless we deal with the underlying issue, the public health consequences of uncontrolled fires.
Okay. Again, Mother Nature if we don't help, can wipe things out, set us back decades, actually. What holistic steps can Congress and state and local governments take to do our part in reducing the devastating blazes in California and across the U.S.?
I think we talked a lot about funding today, making sure that we have the resources for the proactive work, to do the proactive restoration work. I think there are things we can do to help individuals, make sure there's mitigation money and things like that, but also making sure we're doing prescribed burns, making sure we're doing good management. And frankly, you have some of the best people in the country in California. The challenge is they don't have the resources they need to do the scale of restoration they need given the scale of the impacts, and we have to help solve that problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just like hurricanes aren't limited to Florida or the Gulf of Mexico, wildfires are not limited to the West. In 2009, Horry County fire down in Myrtle Beach, same place being affected by Hurricane Florence, experienced 24 miles, 20,000 acres burned, 70 homes destroyed, 2,500 people evacuated. In my district, we have the Sumter National Forest, which is 370,442 acres. So national forest and forest fires are not limited to the West. My wife owns property in Montana. We've been out there since I graduated college in 1989. We've seen what the spotted owl controversy did to the timber industry in the West. I believe that was the beginning of the change of mitigation practices and how forests were managed all throughout the West, not just in Montana. Families that were supported by timber dollars lost their jobs. Ms. German from Montana can probably attest the number of sawmills that are lost, the number of timber families that have been displaced, and the lack of timber activity that you saw in the late 80s and 90s. It went away. It went away. And at that point, we started managing our forests differently. So I've traveled in Montana. I was out there this summer in August. I saw all the smoke. I experienced the smell. I saw that all the tourists that came into Kalispell and Glacier National Airport to go to Glacier National Park probably didn't see the beautiful scenery of that national park due to the fires. And that was before the Lake McDonald fire. While we were there, had a lightning storm, 4 lightning strikes, caused 4 fires. One of them was the Lake McDonald fire. Burned all the way down the lake right there in Glacier National Park. 3 of the other lightning strikes from the same storm didn't burn near as much because they actually hit on property that had been managed properly, and the fires were able to be contained a lot quicker than that in the national park, because we don't do any sort of mitigation efforts in national parks. I'm not advocating for that, but I think we ought to at least think outside the box when we're talking about managing fires. Last summer, not this past August, but a year ago, I was also in Montana, and the Gibraltar Ridge fire, which you probably are aware of up in Eureka, Montana, that was burning very close to our property. So I took it as an opportunity upon myself, and I challenge every member of Congress and on this committee to go to a fire camp and visit with the people that are fighting the fires in the fire camp, like I did in Eureka, Montana, and then get in the truck with the forest manager and go out to the fire line and see how these fires are fought. Because I went to the Gibraltar Ridge fire and I spent 3 hours on the fire line to see the techniques that were being used, mainly mitigation efforts to keep that fire from moving toward where people lived and that personal property, to keep it from being destroyed. Other than that, it was just trying to contain the fire to keep more forest acreage from being burned, but they weren't trying to put the fire out at all. In fact, on in the wilderness study area, that was minimally invasive suppression techniques, mist techniques. So they weren't doing anything up there but maybe trying to contain it a little bit. Very difficult to get to, I get that. We need to, having said all that, we need to back up as a nation and start talking about how we manage our forest. That means more timber activity. This is the American taxpayers' resources, and it's growing. It's going to regrow. We have practiced timber sales forever, and one of the ways that we can mitigate the pine beetle is cut the timber. She said we don't have a funding stream to do some of these clearing techniques. Guess what? It's called timber sales. They pay for themselves, actually provide revenue back to the government to provide revenue for these expenses. And so let's manage our forest. Let's sell some of the timber. And then let's look at shading along roads and near where residential areas are. Let's look at fire breaks. Let's look at prescribed burning. I mentioned the Horry County fire earlier. The reason that fire was so bad and got out of control, and even the firefighters had to employ shelters to let the fire go over them to keep from losing their lives, is because the northerners that moved down to South Carolina and occupied in Myrtle Beach did not like the smoke from prescribed burning. And so prescribed burning didn't happen. And because the prescribed burning did not happen, there was a lot of fuel there. And once that fire started, it burned out of control because there was so much fuel for it. And if we don't manage these fires out west and even in South Carolina with prescribed burning and good management techniques, we're going to continue to see out of control wildfires. They're very difficult to contain, and we're going to pray for a snowfall to put these daggum things out, because that's what they pray for out west, is that snow to get there. They see a thunderstorm come in August. That's kind of a double-edged sword. It's providing some moisture to help contain some of that fire, but it's also providing additional lightning strikes. I was talking to Brian Donner at the Kootenai National Forest, the forest ranger there. You may know Brian. He said while they were fighting one fire, a lightning storm came in. They saw lightning hit over on a hill. They saw the tree it hit. They knew right where to go. But before they could get there, because of the amount of fuel that was there was 5 or 10 acres already burning, and that was very difficult to start containing at that point on the top of that mountain. Had they done prescribed burning and that fuel had gone away, that fire would have been contained a lot quicker. You said, and the last thing I'll say, Mr. Chairman, because I was just providing a lot of information. She said in her statement, thank you, over the past century, and this was a good statement, by the way, Mr. Chairman, over the past century, a culture of fire exclusion unfortunately removed the natural role of fire from the public consciousness. When combined with the reduced level of forest management in many areas of the country, fire exclusion led to the buildup of forest fuels to unprecedented levels. Despite our attempts to manage wildfire, many of our forests are more fire-prone than ever, and that is the truth. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognize gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
5 minutes.
My constituents in San Diego are acutely aware of these issues. I do think it was progress to do the fire fix. I worked really hard on that to make sure that we weren't spending our prevention money on fighting fires, because it just makes it harder to do. You're never going to catch up. Mr. O'Mara, I had 2 questions for you, though, specifically on the Clean Air Act. In your testimony, you noted the strange thing where you're, in terms of calculating your compliance, whether you're in attainment of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, you're penalized for prescribed burns, but not necessarily for natural burns that happen as a result of not taking care of things. You suggest that EPA can take care of this themselves. Is that not something Congress has to do? Or tell me why EPA can change that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the record in the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, this anthropogenic versus natural kind of distinction isn't as clear-cut as you might think. I mean, it's been an administrative practice, and the challenge is that you have to build your prescribed burn in your state implementation plan and basically account for it. If you have a wildfire, you have to, it's basically excluded. You get a kind of an exemption because it's kind of considered natural. The challenge is, so I was in Delaware at the time, we're trying to prescribe burns. Delaware has so many challenges with being downwind pollution from coal plants and things like that in the Midwest. There's nowhere to put it in the SIP, right? You got to find a different place and some other source to offset. And so it becomes a big burden. So you end up not doing the very thing that would help protect you long-term because of the potential penalty.
So you think that can be addressed at an administrative
I believe so.
level?
I believe so, but yeah.
Okay. One other question for you. I liked what you did, which was sort of throw out your notes, so I'll throw out my notes a little bit and ask you, if you were in charge of allocating money for fire, where would you put it first? What would be, you think, the highest priority for new fire money? And
I mean, there are great collaborative plans that have been on the books for years that don't have the resources to get on the ground. I mean, I think I would prioritize the kind of the wildland urban interface projects that have the potential
Right.
loss of human life.
So would
but I would pour money into mitigation. I would pour money into prescribed burns. I'd pour money into the collaborative plans that already have buy-in among communities because they're going to move faster through the process. But I mean, we need to move from a couple acres a year to tens of millions of acres a year. We don't have the capacity at this point. I mean, the Forest Service has been, through sequester, I mean, their resources were taken down so far, in addition to not having the money because of the fire borrowing issue. I mean, we got to rebuild fire capacity in this country at both the federal and state level.
the collaborative plans you talk about are regional collaborative plans?
At the regional level, yeah.
Right, okay. Then what sort of management reforms would you like to see enacted? Management reforms, because I have to confess, I hear a lot of discussion back and forth that sounds like disagreement, but I never quite understand kind of what is it that we're fighting over.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are places where you could have more efficient processes, right? I mean, there's things where, maybe not having to go through the same level of review for individual parts of a project if you actually do the analysis at the landscape level. I mean, we've layered on so many parts of the process.
How do I write that down? How do I write that down from here? Like, what does that mean?
We'd love to work with you on it. There are ways to do it. I mean, there was some language that Senator Cantwell was working on around Ponderosa Pine, basically trying to say, look, if it fits this kind of landscape project, we'll have kind of one analysis, kind of one environmental impact review, as opposed to having to do every individual discrete component. So there are some things we could do at the landscape level. Some of that could be done administratively, and if the Forest Service had predictable resources to be able to do that kind of planning. But a lot of these forest plans are 20 and 30 and 40 years old. It means that we're updating project plans. We're not looking at the landscape level. And I would love to work with you on that, because I think that could be bipartisan. I don't think that would be a controversial issue.
Okay, we would. I mean, obviously, I'm particularly interested in the urban forest interface, and I'm concerned about the fact that it's not even October, and we've already had a fire season. Right. We're not even into October, so we're getting ready for what we hear from our local firefighters is as bad a condition or worse than 2003 and 2007, which were the fires that cost San Diego County a lot of property and money and damage. So we're very interested in taking you up on that, and we'll look forward to talking to you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson. Thanks for joining us. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing today. While most of our witnesses, many of our witnesses are from western states, these issues are certainly relevant to where I live here there in Ohio. I have a significant portion of the Wayne National Forest within my district, which will from time to time carry out prescribed burns. The Wayne is a patchwork of public and private land, so these burns are meant to protect human property and reduce potential damages from wildfire, but they can also encourage the growth of plant life and help ensure oaks, for example, remain prevalent within the forest. So while we've heard about the benefits of these practices, prescribed burns today, whether that's air quality, safety, et cetera, I'd like to discuss the planning that's undertaken before a burn happens. It's crucial that many factors are considered before conducting a burn, such as temperature, humidity, atmosphere stability, wind direction, and speed, as well as smoke dispersion. So a question for either Ms. German or Mr. Boggess or both, along with other resource constraints and other issues, I'm sure these factors that I just listed inhibit the ability to accomplish all that's needed to be accomplished over the course of a month or a year. So how do you balance the factors in planning with the need to efficiently manage healthy forests?
You mentioned it already that it's planning. You've got to look out, and we have a meteorologist on staff because of the very conditions you're talking about. And we have an urbanizing state, much less, I know Montana has 1 million folks. We have 28 million. In Ohio's, the same way, you're a very populated state, so you've got to take those into consideration. We have 94% privately owned. So we don't have the luxury of, if a fire starts, we have got to get on it and we suppress them all because there's human lives and property and improved property at stake. And so you've got to plan that. And because of that, you have to have folks that are dedicated to, we call them predictive services. So they're telling us days and weeks ahead what the weather is going to look like and what, when is it going to be right. And so you have these plans written way ahead of time, and you know that this is the time, this is the window that this particular piece of land will burn. And so then you have the Good Neighbor Authority on federal lands that you work with with our partners there. And so we've got those agreements done well in advance. And so you're not like, oh my gosh, it's a good day to burn, and you go out and burn. And so the planning is crucial.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, you have anything to add?
Certainly, I think one of the challenges, and we were talking about before this hearing, is the social license that you have with this, and something that we constantly face, our federal partners, we as state agencies face when we're planning prescribed burning is the communication piece. So educating the public, getting them to understand the benefits of that. In the state of Montana, we burn on average about 30 to 40,000 acres of forested land per year, prescribed burning. We need to do about 10 times that from an ecological perspective to really have an impact on fuels reduction. And one of the things that we find the most challenging is getting the public buy-in. So I think in addition to all the planning is the communication piece of that we need to constantly be doing better.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, along those same lines, how do you choose what section of forest to address next, particularly if you can't treat every section that needs to be treated? You said you're doing 10 or you're doing 45,000. You need to do 10 times that many. How do you decide which 45,000 acre plot to do?
So there's a number of different filters, and I want to clarify that in the state of Montana, we don't just put prescribed burning on the ground. We have to do active mechanical fuels reduction before we do that because our fuels are at such unprecedented levels. We use a number of different things statewide, and I'll talk about our forest action plan that we're going to be undertaking. What we did do in the state of Montana is our governor did identify 5 million acres of priority treatment, and that was on Forest Service land under the authority of the 2014 Farm Bill. So we matched that along with high severity areas identified by community wildfire protection plans. We use collaborative groups to really help identify where we need to be focusing our treatment. A lot of that is driven by forest pests, insect and disease occurrence, fuel loading, wildfire hazard. We have a lot of that data, and that's where we typically plan our priority treatments.
Okay, well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman of California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman and ranking member. It feels kind of strange. This morning we were talking about hurricanes, and now we're talking about wildfires, but both of those have some connection to climate impacts. So this has to be a holistic discussion. Now, it seems to me that the difficulty is managing forests to prevent and minimize damage, but also protecting health and safety. On the other hand, is it necessary, or will it be necessary at all, to prevent, to manage development so that we don't put people and property at risk at these high-risk areas? So my question was sort of a general one for whoever wants to answer. How should we be thinking more holistically about fires and management?
I'd like to respond to that.
Sure.
In your state, which I've been down there many times fighting fire, has that Mediterranean climate, and your fuels cure much earlier in the season, and they stay cured much longer, and then you have the Santa Ana wind event in the Southern California. So dispensable space around houses and evacuation routes need to be a lot more thought through because fire in your state burns very quickly. As a firefighter, we say in Oregon, sometimes you can't run fast enough. In California, you can't drive fast enough. So I think that's something that you need to take in consideration as you build your communities and expand them into what we call the urban interface, that those conditions are really taken into consideration, defensible space and evacuation routes.
Well, I'd like to sort of direct this to Ms. Germain. How are you working with communities to manage building in these high-risk areas?
You know, in Montana, and some research just came out from one of our groups out of Bozeman that showed that just tremendous amount of money is being spent in the wildland-urban interface and in suppressing fires. And I will say in Montana, we're kind of in the infancy of talking about this from a land use planning perspective. But what we do as DNRC, we're really trying to interface with the local government to help them organize around the tenets of the cohesive strategy, talk to them about fire-adapted communities, the stuff that we're experts at forest management, really helping local governments do that treatment in and around homes and educate people on the risks of living in the wildland-urban interface. But from a planning perspective, it's really pretty much in its infancy in the state of Montana.
So do you feel the local communities are responsive to your advice and input?
Certainly, absolutely. We pride ourselves in really excellent relationships with local governments. We have a local government forest advisor who is engaging with county commissioners and volunteer fire departments on engaging with the Forest Service, which is the predominant landowner, forested landowner around their communities, about suppression efforts, about forest fuels reduction. And certainly we help deliver a lot of that education to private landowners within their communities.
Mr. O'Mara, is there a lack of funding that we can address at the federal level to improve how we as a nation handle wildfire management?
Yes. I mean, I think, look, it's amazing what the Congress did in the last session, fixing the fire borrowing practice. It's still an underinvestment. And, you know, I often say that, like, all Americans are libertarians until they need help. Like, we got to figure out a way to monetize some of these costs, right? I mean, they're putting people in harm's way. They're putting firefighters in harm's way. We're doing the same thing in flood insurance, right? I mean, it's the same thing. We're basically paying people to be on the, to be in more risky areas. And so I just think, I mean, I think we're billions of dollars short in terms of the amount of money we have to do towards active restoration annually. I mean, that's the kind of level of funding that we're going to need. Because Chairman McKinley and I've had back and forth on many issues over the years. He's exactly right. We got, and I'm going to say when he's not here, because we're not talking about the East Coast forests enough. The East Coast forests and the Great Lakes forests have equal threats. They're just a couple of years behind in terms of the temperature patterns. So,
well, I think one of the big controversies or areas of disagreement is whether we should use suppression or management. And from the science that I've seen, the fire areas can be managed better, and it gives the forests a better chance to recuperate and create natural fire breaks and natural water sheds and so on. So I wouldn't rush to one or the other, but I'd lean toward management in my opinion. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank our panelists for being here. We will send Mr. McKinley a video of your comments where you agree with him. I don't know how that's going to play out. But we do appreciate our work is better informed by your participation. I know some of you, including the Senator, have traveled great distances, and we thank you for doing that. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions for the first panel, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. And before we conclude, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to submit the following documents for the record. 2 academic reports entitled Prescribed Fire in North American Forests and Woodlands and Prescribed Fire Policy Barriers and Opportunities, and document from the National Academy of Sciences called The Impact of Anthropogenic Climate Change on Wildfire Across Western U.S. Forests, an article from GeoHealth, Future Fire Impacts on Smoke Concentrations, Visibility, and Health in the Contiguous United States. The Washington Post editorial board, We Won't Stop California's Wildfires If We Don't Talk About Climate Change. New York Times article, Trump inaccurately claims California is wasting waters as fires burn. The Scientific American article, Fuels by Climate Change, Wildfires Erode Air Quality Gains, and document from the National Wildlife Federation, Megafires. And in pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. And I ask that our witnesses respond to those questions within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. And so, again, thank you all for participating in this very important hearing, and without objection, this subcommittee is adjourned.